I thought we'd begin by talking a little bit about why it is that the sort of traditional, what people think of as the traditional model of higher education, i.e. student takes on lots of debt, goes and lives in a new city for 3 years, 4 years, kind of comes back with degree, doesn't work for a large number of Americans. Maybe you could start us off, Gerald, with some of your experience with Europe.
Sure, and I think the word traditional education is an interesting way to describe what, John, you just articulated. And so we'll start with a little test, be a good way to do this. Do me a favor. Raise your hand if you have a 4-year degree. Keep your hand up if you got that degree between the ages of 18 and 22. Just take a quick look around. Probably talking, and put your hands down. What, 80, 90%? Now, if you asked any 100 adults in America, anywhere in this land, those same 2 questions, what percentage of hands do you think would be up? What do you think? 40? 28? 15? 8 hands would be up. 8 hands would be up in America today of any 100 adults if we said, do you have a 4-year degree and did you get it between the ages of 18 and 22? So when we think about traditional higher education, viewed through a linear lens of I go to school for 4 years, I then go to work, that actually isn't what's being consumed by the vast, vast majority of Americans today. Yet interestingly, who's thinking about policy and structure? Is it the 92% who would not say yes to those 2 questions, or the 8% who perhaps their educational experience was consumed in what historically might have been a traditional setting? So I think there's a fundamental rethink of what's happening today in America. How are our citizens gaining post-secondary education and combining that with work? And what does that mean for how we have to think about the ongoing system of both people doing both pay-worthy and credit-worthy activity concomitantly?
Bill, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. No, it's a great point. A major reason for the shift in hands to go up is that while the demographics of the United States have changed significantly over the last 40 or 50 years, the structure of higher education is not. It is still structured to serve a very small number of students who come directly out of high school and go to have that residential experience, while, as Gerald points out, that's fewer than 25% of who goes to school today. 75% of undergraduates in the country look like a University of Phoenix student. And even that student has changed significantly. When I came to University of Phoenix in the mid-90s, we were serving adult learners. And the demographics of our students in those days was a 35-year-old white male middle manager. If I were to take the demographics of a University of Phoenix and many other institutions, students today, and build the typical student, it would be a 29-year-old African-American single mother. That tells us something significant has happened to our population. But higher education, I think, if it has failed to serve, has failed because it does not recognize that it's a very different world. My degrees are in Latin and Greek and linguistics, which obviously qualifies me to be the president of University of Phoenix. But in the days when I graduated with my PhD in 1900, a good liberal arts degree was the key to the world. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, that's not necessarily the case today.
Both of you represent institutions that are thinking a lot about how to connect people once they have sort of graduated or studied with you with the business world. I suppose one of the traditional advantages that the kind of 4-year residential thing has is not just that people learn, some skills, how to use, some mathematical skills or what have you that might be useful in their employment, but also they somehow absorb some kind of cultural thing that's in the air at that college that then allows them to kind of flourish in a workplace which is full of people who've been in similar backgrounds. How do you go about teaching teaching that stuff, which we expect colleges to do as well, when you don't necessarily have the kind of, the kids there?
So one could argue that traditional higher education, traditional college, is a pretty expensive process for socialization of the kind you just articulated. When you think about not just the price of higher education. I was a trustee at Bowdoin for 10 years, and the price may be $55,000, but the cost is $86,000 per student per year when you look at what the endowment kicks in. So multiply 86,000 times 4, 344,000. That's a pretty expensive process to do what you just articulated, which are learning non-academic cognitive skills in addition to academic skills. So, and I would argue, I think Heckman would say the exact same thing, that people can learn these non-academic cognitive skills, attitudinal, behavioral, some of the communication skills, how to work in teams. You can learn that relatively quickly, a lot more cost-effectively than how it is done or not done on some of our campuses and higher education institutions today.
Bill, you have a lot of students studying business at University of Phoenix. How do you go about that?
Well, pretty much the way that Gerald is describing here. I mean, first say, however, I'm not in favor of doing away with the traditional residential experience. I think that experience will not go away. It will be part of the higher education landscape, but it will be a different stratum from what we're talking about today. Now, the way we approach that kind of culturalization is first to see where our students are. Adult students simply aren't interested in some of those kinds of enculturations because they already have them. They have families, they have social networks that they function very well in. What we try to do is help them adapt those skills then to the workplace, because I think that's the key, and that's where programs like Gear Up are very helpful. And we have very similar kinds of programs at University of Phoenix, where you have to look at what business sometimes calls the soft skills to make sure that once people have the technical skills and the knowledge they need, that they can then have that soft skill to translate it into the business place. And we have courses and seminars for that.
And business would say, I mean, we've worked with 450 businesses, over 10,000 students over 14 years, and we hear consistently, you give me someone who has the attitude, behavior, and communication skills, and we will teach them the rest. You also hear consistently, you hire for skills and fire for behavior. So in terms of helping folks develop the behaviors and the attitudes consistent with professional work, most employers will bite your arm off if you can give them someone who shows up ready, willing, and able to learn and work, and can work well within teams, and is hungry and motivated and not entitled to the job that they currently have.
What do you both think are the best ways to measure success for higher education for those Americans who are not in the 8% with their hands up? I mean, I guess the kind of bluntest one would be, is the student employed in gainful employment after this, after this course? But that leaves a whole load of other stuff out, and also brings in a whole load of things that are not within the educational institution's control. I mean, at the moment, the Department for Education is in the business of coming up with this rating system for all colleges and universities, which we'll get next year. But is there a metric that is not so kind of horribly blunt that it won't kind of distort behavior or give a kind of unfair picture of whether institutions are being successful or not?
Well, I think if you look at a single metric like gainful employment, the answer to your question is no, there's not one. Gainful employment, the formula for gainful employment, which relates earnings to how much one pays for a program, I think is probably short-sighted in a number of ways. One of which is, if I want to be a social worker, and I can't expect to make much money, and I understand what it's going to cost me to become a social worker, but I want to do that, I should be able to do that and not have my institution punished for that. Yeah. I think that's one issue. But a broader issue is that formulas like gainful employment need to be applied if they are applied, to higher education in general. And that's where we hit the rub, because gainful employment would put many community colleges at risk, certainly historically black colleges at risk, and actually people would be surprised to find out that many public institutions with names that they recognize would not pass.
Right. And so I think what we're doing is going from a situation where there probably was a very low level of accountability towards some of those potential end games, struggling with what is the right type of incentive structure. So we, in many states, pay community colleges to matriculate, and after the 15th day of a person being on the campus, you get 100% of your federal monies. So the question is 15 right? Should it be 60, 90? Should it be after a certain number of credits are earned? So I think there are ways to think about how funding is applied. Certainly for one, I chair a local community college in Boston, and half of our state appropriation is based now on performance. We argued for that, we lobbied for that. I think it's a good thing, but it has to be worked over the next several years, as opposed to saying that's going to be the right answer. It's a step in the direction, and we should hold ourselves accountable as state institutions, but we're going to have to take some years to figure out the right metric. Because what I said at the community college I chair is, we should ask every student, why are you here? And what is your goal in coming to this institution? And we should be held accountable for helping that person to achieve the goals they've set for themselves. At the end of the day, if you're doing that for your citizens, it's probably a pretty a good outcome measure.
We were talking a little earlier about the way in which failure, dropout rates, and students being burdened with lots of debt, and some kind of notable failures among private sector colleges has made life difficult for all the rest of the providers in this area. You know, some government bureaucracies have really kind of lasered in on them as a result. What's been the practical effect of that for you at Phoenix?
Well, over the years, and during my tenure as president, it had effects that most of you have probably read about in either your trade papers or sometimes in your local paper. It has affected our ability to serve many students. The university is somewhat smaller than it was 10 years ago, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but what it has forced us to do is to rethink how we best serve our students. And you would see that the University of Phoenix now has undertaken a campaign which, for better or worse, we can call student protection. But before students take their first class, they are required to build a financial plan so they understand what the cost of higher education will be, for instance, because higher education is interesting in that while it's probably the second largest investment that any person makes in their life, we don't ever think about it in those terms. I mean, you wouldn't go and buy a house and say, I'll take that house, it's $1 million, but I'm sure I can afford it. I mean, you would say, well, what's the monthly payment going to be? How much am I going to put down? How long will it take me to amortize that? But in higher education, we talk about cost per credit hour, tuition per semester, and it's often not until the student has actually graduated that they go, oh, you mean that was $200,000? So I think part of it is making sure that we educate students properly so that the students who come to us have that much more opportunity to be successful. So it has changed our behavior in a number of ways, which I think are beneficial both for the institution, because now we help students who can best succeed come to the universities so that we can help them.
John, can we talk a little bit about community colleges? You have some experience there. You've been called into Boston to sit on the board of this college that has a 6% graduation rate. There's a lot of effort being put in to making community colleges better. I think there's an understanding everywhere, really, that they are sort of key to educating people for whom, for whatever reason, the kind of first experience with education hasn't gone particularly well. What do you think the fix is there?
Well, we've historically underfunded our community colleges. And the analogy I use is it's like giving a starving person crumbs and being disappointed that they're not gaining weight and being healthy. So if you look at some of the excellent community colleges. We partner with Northern Virginia Community College. Bob Templin, their president, is exceptional, very connected to business. And he would say, Gerald, here's the amount of money I have to work with. So what you're doing with young people in terms of social emotional support and connection to industry requires resources. If we either generate a new revenue stream to pay for that, because I don't have the additional funding coming from my existing sources to do that, I believe most community colleges, we partner with Miami-Dade College down in Miami, Dr. Padron would say, we absolutely want to do the things that you are doing, which is helping with noise outside of one's life, the noise people face, developmental education, and financial constraints. That's why folks are dropping out of college. I think community colleges sometimes unfairly can be kind of mislabeled. If you talk to most community colleges, and many that I've spoken with, they want to do the right thing. They know what their students' needs are, but they're working in some pretty interesting constraints. That's not to absolve them of responsibility, and it's not to say there aren't structural impediments and there aren't some pretty slow-moving, not as innovative as we would like community colleges out there. But having spent some time around them, I've been more surprised positively than negatively at the willingness of folks to actually want to serve those young people and give them the best education they can give them.
Bill, can I ask about your experience connecting graduates with businesses? I mean, do businesses really want to get involved in the education of future potential employees, or are they much happier just saying, kind of we'll leave all that stuff to you and then send us a bunch of candidates at the end and we'll reject, 4 out of 5? I mean, is there a kind of willingness to work with higher education institutions of whatever shape or form there?
Yeah, well, your latter scenario, excuse me, is the one that I think both higher education and businesses would prefer, that higher education would do a great job of preparing people who would come out and instantly be successful. However, as we know, in America today, we have many jobs that are unfilled, and yet we have a relatively high unemployment rate, which tells us there's a gap. We've gone to businesses at University of Phoenix and asked, what is it that you want? Because it's my feeling that in order for us to really close the jobs gap, it has to be a conversation in which both sides are proactive. Businesses have to be able to articulate what it is that they need in the way of skills. Especially in a more global economy, in a more technologically advanced economy, what one means by critical thinking skills or communication skills will differ significantly from business to business. So the communications might be anything from report writing to doing what we're doing today. And businesses need to be able to better articulate that so that higher education can adapt. Unfortunately, on both sides, as we were talking before we came out, the connection between higher education and the workforce is seen as an add-on. So that, for instance, if I were going to go to a company to talk about what skills they're looking for, there's no particular person that I might get directed to. Wouldn't necessarily be the vice president of HR or anyone. And in higher ed, part of the reason that Year Up is with us is that in order to be successful on the higher ed part or on the ed part, we need to have a formalized structure to help facilitate that conversation.
And I think what to me has been true and will increasingly be true is business will increasingly get in the business of education. I don't think there's anything that's going to get in the way of that because they're not getting the product, the pipeline of talent that they need. And so we're going to be seeing more and more attempts and partnerships of business actually working more closely with higher education. And even starting in middle school, which I believe career readiness should be starting in middle and high school, and then early college and transitioning much more seamlessly. And I think the system we need is going to be more fluid than it has been in terms of the multiple pathways within which folks can actually get into the labor force. The fact is that 50% of folks who go to college work full-time, right? And 85% of people who go to college work in some way, shape, or form. And so business being attendant to that. And I think business, this is not just a higher ed issue. business also has a set of practices that often don't allow that lens or that aperture to be as wide as it could be. So think about, don't apply unless you have a 4-year degree, right? So the degree is a proxy for something an employer wants, some sort of competency or set of competencies. But it's the only proxy we have. But we're increasingly getting closer to look beyond the proxy to what we really want from someone. So Europe has worked with a number of Fortune 100 companies who said, we love you, but we can't hire anyone because our HR policy says you can't get a job here without a 4-year degree. We say, well, just try it, test it, see what happens. And amazingly, each one of those companies, and it'd be the biggest financial institutions in the world, have come back and said, oh, we have to hire this person. Tell HR to change the policy. And so I think business also has a responsibility to think about how are they attracting and opening up the lens towards talent. Simple things like tuition advancement versus tuition reimbursement. When you're making $35,000 a year, tuition reimbursement's a lovely thought, but you can't front the money for a college. So tweaks in practices that I think are in business interests to actually help part of that education process we'll increasingly see. And your foresighted businesses are going to be building stronger links with higher education, and I think both parties benefiting in the process.
Okay, well, thank you both. We're going to take some questions now, please. If you, usual routine, stick your hands up, introduce yourselves. We'll take them in clumps so we can get through as many as we can. Yes, ma'am. Please.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Michelle Toulier from Georgia Tech, where I'm Executive Director of the Career Center for all the undergraduate and graduate students. I'd like to hear your thoughts on some of the most effective ways, either that you've seen or that you have ideas would work well, for helping students develop those soft skills, those workplace readiness skills that you talk about. Particularly curious to hear your thoughts on whether the education in that area can be done just within the educational institution, workshops, seminars taught by faculty who have some real-world experience, by the career advisors, as well as anything involving partnering with business and industry to develop that. In other words, is there anything you've seen out there that's working well or that you would like to see that you think could work well?
Thank you. We'll just take one. Yes, sir.
Hi, Gerald, the point you made about corporations and their ability to, or willingness to hire someone that's got a more of an online or an experiential background, in your best guess, how long do you think it'll change for it to be more pervasive, that companies are prepared to make that change? And then what % is going to be the right number? You're not going to switch to hire all your employees just from online or experience. But do you have a number in your head that you think might be the right or acceptable number to global corporations?
We'll take one more. You're from the new school, aren't you, in New York? Yeah. No, that's great. Yeah, yes, sir.
Jack Wolf, Moore Associates, Consulting in Higher Education. I saw some statistics recently that ran along these lines. Students viewed their readiness in terms of employment at roughly sort of the 14% range. Employers said about 11% of students were ready. College presidents said approximately 70% of our students are ready. To what degree is that gap real, and what can be done to address it?
Should we start with the last question first about readiness? And I'm going to send that to you, Bill, if that's okay.
Sure. Well, I think in answer to that, I think the gap probably is pretty real. Because to some extent, higher education is in denial or is ignoring the fact that employers are increasingly saying that the students that we're turning out are not ready. How do we address it? I think we change the conversation that we have with the business community. The conversation previously was, send us your employees, or send us people you want to be your employees, and we will we'll educate them and send them back to you, without really getting a good sense of what it was that business wanted. The conversation has to be changed to higher education going to businesses and saying, how can we help you? What do you need? And then taking that back and having that influence the curriculum.
Gerald, can I send you the question about soft skills? I mean, your organization is often trying to teach people these soft skills. What works?
So having high expectations for young people certainly works. Those who haven't been, who want to be held to high standards and haven't. What we tend to do is we created something called a professional training corps, modeled after the ROTC, but actually rather than wear Army fatigues, you wear a suit. Rather than study military moves, you study Microsoft mouse moves. Rather than go on a field training exercise, you go on an internship. So you can imagine when you go, I was in Georgetown's campus recently, and you saw students dressed up in their ROTC program. So they were at Georgetown, but they had made an additional commitment to join ROTC. Well, we've done the exact same thing, except we call it PTC, Professional Training Corps. And those young adults come on campus, they're dressed professionally. We held our breath the first time we did this, so they're going to be ridiculed or what they're, and you know what? They're the cool kids. They're actually, oh, you look like you're going to really take advantage of this education. And this is in Baltimore City Community College, 3% graduation rate. And our students are seen as, I was in a college in Philly yesterday in front of about 50 students, and they all were dressed as we are today. He said, how many students have been asked if you work for the institution? About 70% of hands went up, right? They are holding themselves to higher standards. They are proud to actually look and act as professionals, and they recognize that a professional learning environment is in their interest. Yet often, I think, in community colleges, we haven't felt like we had the right or responsibility to talk about attitude and behavior, which ostensibly someone needs to learn in an educational setting if you're not getting it either in a community setting or from the role models in your own home.
I haven't forgotten the question about willingness of businesses to hire, but we've got a couple of minutes left. Can we just take some more questions, and then I'll throw that in as well? Yes.
Some articles have been talking more about apprenticeship programs, and you have countries like Germany with the cooperative state education system. And I'm just curious if you believe that a move towards more of an apprenticeship model might work, and what would hold it back where you have both the university and the employer selecting the student at the same time.
Thank you. Yes, yes, ma'am, in the middle. Can we get a microphone? Yeah, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Edie Fraser, STEM Connector. If we look at the skills gap, and we're saying 71% of all jobs require computer science and technology skills, is what and how do you see that part of training of innovation changing higher education and all education?
Okay, thank you. We're going to make this a rapid-fire round. Apprenticeships, Bill, first off, would that be a...
Sure. Yeah, well, I think that actually Year Up is a good step in that direction, but we need higher education to follow it. I think the broader question here, or the broader issue, is that, especially in the 70s and the 80s, the United States education system abandoned vocational education and devalued certificates, devalued the two-year degree. When you look at the European structure or the German education system, which is often held up, I think that's not a bad model. Do we need to follow it exactly? No, but I think we need to understand that post-secondary education now needs to be a lifelong learning, and the degree does not necessarily need to be the first goal. The first goal needs to be something that helps the student be successful and become more self-sufficient, and is something on which they can build. And I think that apprenticeships and vocational tracks are exactly the way to go.
Gerald, we're right out of time, but if you could just briefly answer those questions about willingness to hire students from kind of non-traditional educational, kind of pathways, I guess, and also about tech skills.
Sure. So I think we've worked a lot with HR directors and really understand what prohibits them from changing some of those practices. We've chosen, rightly or wrongly, a point of we can get 10% of the hires in a particular function. So if you're hiring 500 people in quality assurance testing or cybersecurity, if we can look at a minimum of 10%, we felt that's a relevant level, that if you got rid of 10% of your pipeline of talent, it would probably be somewhat painful for you. So we chose that as a floor to get above in terms of trying to change those practices. What we've seen is HR directors are willing to do this. We have to help empower them to do this because they're not always supported to make these types of changes, but I think they can. And we absolutely need that to happen. I think with technology, rightly or wrongly, I see technology as a liberal art. And I'm sure in some traditional halls of higher education, they may not agree with me. But to be functioning in the 21st century and not to be have information literacy and technical knowledge, I think would hamstring anyone. And we're going to need the earlier introduction of that, really starting earlier in K-12, to help young folks be fluid and employed in a knowledge-based economy. And the final comment is on apprenticeships. We need vocational education for a knowledge-based economy. And that's structural. But there's also a cultural piece. We need to value alternative pathways into the mainstream of this country, and it starts with us. If our son or daughter came home and said, Mom, Dad, I'm marrying someone and they don't have a college degree, how do you feel? Or they went a different path. There's a cultural retardant in terms of do we look like a Germany or Northern European country. There are cultural roots here as well that have overvalued in some respect the traditional path. That starts with us culturally as well as systemically. How do the structures support those multiple pathways?